The day I turned 38, my father looked me in the eye and told me I was no longer needed. Not in those exact words, of course. He never said anything directly. That was the thing about my father, he had a talent for delivering devastation wrapped in quiet, reasonable sentences. He called me into his office on a Tuesday morning in March, the kind of gray, overcast day where the light through the blinds made everything look washed out. He was sitting behind his desk, the same mahogany desk he'd had since I was a little girl, and he folded his hands on top of a stack of papers and said, "I've made a decision about the company's future. I'm transferring operational control to your brother. Effective the 1st of next month." I sat there for a moment, just trying to hear him correctly. "I think it's the right time," he continued, already looking down at his papers, as if the conversation were essentially finished. "Ryan is ready to step up." I asked him what that meant for my position. I was the CFO. I had been the CFO for 6 years. Before that, I spent 4 years working as a financial analyst at the firm, learning the business from the ground up, while my brother spent those same years bouncing between a failed app startup and a consulting venture that had no clients. I had helped build the revenue model that tripled our property portfolio. I had restructured our debt financing during the market downturn and saved the company from a genuinely serious crisis. My father said, "We're restructuring. Your role will be absorbed into the new leadership framework." I asked him what that meant. He said, "Ryan will bring on his own team." There it was. Buried under corporate language, delivered in a Tuesday morning voice, on my 38th birthday. I was being pushed out. I drove home that evening in a kind of strange, suspended silence, not crying, not angry yet. Just absorbing it, the way you absorb a physical impact for a few seconds before the pain actually arrives. I kept replaying the moment, trying to find the part where I had misunderstood something. I hadn't. To understand why this hurt the way it did, you have to understand the full picture. You have to know about my mother. She died when I was 11 and my brother Ryan was 6. A car accident on the highway, late at night in November. My father was devastated in the way that quietly reshapes a person from the inside. He never really recovered, not completely. He threw himself into the business, which at that point was a small regional real estate firm my grandfather had started. My grandmother took care of Ryan and me in those first years, and then a series of housekeepers, and then mostly me taking care of Ryan while my father worked. Ryan looked exactly like our mother. Same dark eyes, same easy smile, same way of walking into a room and making people feel comfortable immediately. I looked like my father's side of the family, which my aunts always described diplomatically as strong features. My father never said anything unkind about my appearance. He simply wasn't quite there when he looked at me. Like I was slightly out of focus, existing in a peripheral space he never fully turned toward. I didn't understand this until I was in my late 20s and my aunt, my father's younger sister, told me something over dinner one night after a glass of wine. She said, "You know, it's not your fault that you remind him of everything he lost. You think the same way your mother did. You have her stubbornness. I think sometimes when he looks at you he can see her telling him what to do, and he resented that even when she was alive." She paused, then added, "He loved her, but he never liked being told he was wrong." My mother, apparently, had been the one who kept my father accountable. She had challenged him, pushed back on his worst instincts, told him hard truths. He needed that and hated it at the same time. After she died, he built a version of her in his memory that was softer, more uncomplicated. Ryan, charming and agreeable, who never challenged anything, who laughed at all my father's jokes and deferred to every opinion. Ryan was safe. Ryan was grief without the confrontation. And I was just the reminder of what he'd lost and what he'd never been comfortable with. I want to be clear about something, because it's the question I've asked myself 100 times, and it's probably the question you're asking right now. Why did I stay? Why did I spend 10 years at that company knowing on some level I always knew that I would never be fully seen there? The honest answer is that I believed I could earn it. I am not proud of this, but I believed that if I worked hard enough and produced results that were impossible to ignore, my father would eventually look at what I'd built and recognize it. I thought merit would eventually override whatever emotional static was running in the background. I also, if I'm being completely honest, was deeply afraid of what it would mean about my family if I left. If I walked away, I had to admit that the dynamic was real and permanent, not just a phase, not something that would resolve itself when my father got older and reflective, not something I could fix. I stayed because leaving felt like giving up on the possibility of being loved correctly by my own father. I understand now that this was never something I could fix. But understanding that at 38 is very different from understanding it at 28 or 30. After that Tuesday meeting, I went to my office and closed the door and sat very still for about an hour. I pulled up my financial records for the past 6 years. I looked at every deal, every restructuring, every projection I'd built. I looked at the retention bonus structure I'd negotiated for our senior staff. I looked at the vendor contracts I'd renegotiated down by nearly 22%. I was not doing this to feel sorry for myself. I was doing it because I needed to be very clear about what I had actually done, as opposed to the quiet fiction that had apparently been running in the background, the one where my contributions were simply part of the air the company breathed, and therefore not really attributable to any one person. I had built something real here. And I was being shown the door. My brother had been brought in 8 months earlier as co-director of acquisitions, a title my father had created specifically to give Ryan a foothold. Ryan had a good personality and a decent instinct for reading people in a room. He was not, however, a detail person. He had already missed 2 compliance deadlines that I had quietly caught and corrected before they became problems. He had approved a property valuation without having it independently verified, and I had flagged the discrepancy before we committed capital. He knew I had saved him from that one, and he thanked me in that breezy way he had, the way that suggested gratitude but didn't quite get to acknowledgement. After my father's announcement, Ryan stopped by my office the following morning. He leaned in the doorway in his easy way and said, "Hey, I just want you to know this wasn't my idea. Dad made this call." I looked at him and said, "I know, Ryan." He said, "I hope we can still work together in some capacity. I'm going to need good people around me." I said, "I understand." He seemed relieved by that, which told me everything I needed to know about his expectations. He had expected me to be difficult, and my calmness read to him as acceptance. It wasn't acceptance, it was the beginning of a very clear-eyed decision. That afternoon, I called a former colleague who had been trying to recruit me for 2 years to join a mid-sized commercial real estate advisory firm. I told her I was ready to have a real conversation. I started the process quietly, on my own time, saying nothing to anyone at the company. I spent the next 3 weeks doing 2 things simultaneously. On one track, I did my job with the same exactness I always had, because I was not the kind of person who coasts on the way out the door and lets things fall apart. On the other track, I was documenting everything. Not in a dramatic way. I was simply making sure that every process I owned, every system I had built, every vendor relationship and contract and recurring obligation was written down in detail that anyone could follow. I built a handover document that was thorough enough to run the finance department for 6 months without me. I did this not for my father's benefit and not for Ryan's. I did it because our company had 43 employees, most of whom were good people who worked hard and depended on their paychecks. I was not going to let my exit damage them. My father never asked me how the transition was going. He seemed to assume it would simply happen because things had always simply happened when I was involved. On the last Friday of the month, I submitted my resignation letter. I did not use the word fired because technically I had not been given a termination letter. My father had restructured around me rather than issuing a formal notice, which was his way of avoiding legal complications while achieving the same result. My resignation was clean and professional. I thanked him for the opportunities. I left my keycard and my parking pass on my desk. My brother sent me a text that evening that said, "Sorry it worked out this way. Good luck out there." I didn't respond. My father called once, 2 days later. I let it go to voicemail. He said, "Just checking in. Let me know if you want to grab lunch sometime." No acknowledgement of what had happened, no recognition. Just grab lunch sometime, as if I'd simply changed jobs the way you change dentists. I did not call him back. Over the following months I settled into my new position. The advisory firm was different in every way that mattered. The work was more complex, the clients were sophisticated, and I was treated as an expert from the beginning. My new colleagues asked my opinion not because they were obligated to, but because they actually wanted to know what I thought. I kept expecting the environment to reveal some hidden dysfunction, some version of what I'd left, but it didn't. It was just a functional workplace where competent people worked together and respected each other. I threw myself into it. I took on a major portfolio analysis that had been sitting unresolved for months and restructured the approach entirely. I brought in 2 new institutional clients within my first quarter. I was genuinely good at this, which I had always known, but it felt different to be good at something in a place where the people around you could actually see it. I did not contact my father. I did not contact my brother. I changed my phone number not to be dramatic but because I needed the mental space. My father's single voicemail sat there like an unopened envelope I was not ready to touch. About 11 months after I left, I was driving to a client meeting near my old neighborhood. I passed the office building where my father's company had been headquartered for 20 years. I almost didn't glance over, but I did, and I noticed something. The window signage on the second floor looked different. There was a paper notice taped to the inside of the glass that I couldn't read from the road. I told myself it wasn't my concern and drove on. 3 weeks later, my cousin, my father's niece on his sister's side, the same aunt who had told me the truth about my mother years ago, reached out to me. She said my aunt had asked her to pass along a message. The message was that the company was in serious trouble. Ryan had approved a large acquisition deal that had turned out to be based on fraudulent documentation from the seller's side. My father had not had the legal review done that I always insisted on before committing to anything above a certain threshold. The deal had exposed the company to significant liability. 3 of the senior staff members had already left, including the operations manager who had been there for 12 years. Vendors were sending notices. The bank had flagged the account. My cousin said my aunt was telling me this not to ask for anything, but because she thought I deserved to know. I thanked her and sat with this information for a long time. About a week after that, I was leaving a lunch meeting downtown when I heard someone call my name. I turned around and my father was walking toward me from across the street. He looked older than I remembered, though it had only been 11 months. He was wearing his good coat, the charcoal one he wore for client meetings, but something about him looked less assembled than usual. He said my name again and smiled in that particular way, the familiar, slightly distant warmth that I had spent my entire childhood trying to get closer to. "I've been trying to reach you," he said. "I changed my number," I said. "I heard." He paused. "How have you been? You look good." I said I was doing well. He nodded, looked briefly away and then said, "I could really use your help, sweetheart. Things at the company have gotten complicated. Ryan, he's in over his head a little. And with this acquisition situation there's a lot of financial cleanup that needs to happen. You were always so good at that kind of thing." He said it warmly, as if he were paying me a compliment. As if this were a conversation between 2 adults who had navigated a minor misunderstanding and arrived at a new understanding. I looked at him. Not with anger, exactly. More with a kind of clarity I hadn't quite had access to before. "Dad," I said. "You ended my position at the company. You restructured around me so you wouldn't have to issue a termination. And then Ryan's team moved in and I was gone. That happened." He started to say something. "It wasn't like I built the compliance structure that would have caught the documentation issue with the acquisition before you committed to anything," I said. "I know that because it was my system and it worked every time I was there. And I'm sorry that things are difficult right now, I genuinely am. But I have a job. I have work I'm proud of and people I enjoy working with. And I'm not available." He looked startled. My father had a face that was accustomed to things resolving in his favor, and the expression that moved across it now was something I hadn't seen before. Not quite shame, but something in the vicinity of it. I want to be careful here about what happened next, because what I remember most is not the heat of the moment but the calm of it. We were standing on a downtown sidewalk on a Wednesday afternoon and there were people walking past us and I was not raising my voice. I said, "I want you to really hear me. Not because I want you to feel bad, but because I need to say it and I need you to actually understand it. You looked past me my entire life because I reminded you of something uncomfortable. I worked harder than anyone at that company for 10 years and you handed it to Ryan because Ryan is easier to look at. That's what happened. And the worst part isn't what it did to my career. The worst part is that I let it go on for so long because I kept hoping you would eventually see me." I paused. "I see myself now," I said. "I don't need you to." My father opened his mouth and closed it again. There were a couple people nearby who had slowed, sensing something. "I didn't care." He finally said, quietly, "I didn't realize." "I know you didn't," I said. "That's kind of the whole problem. I told him I had to get back to work. I wished him well with the situation at the company, and I meant it not for the company's sake but for the 40-odd people who still worked there. I told him Ryan should call a restructuring attorney immediately if he hadn't already, and that there were 2 firms I could recommend, good ones, which I would text to my cousin to pass along. And then I walked away. It turned out that someone nearby had recorded part of the exchange. Not the whole thing, just about 45 seconds of it, and the audio was partially obscured by street noise. But it was enough. Someone posted it with a caption about a daughter confronting a father who pushed her out of the family business. It moved through the kind of online channels where these things move. I didn't post it, I didn't share it, I didn't comment on it. I found out it existed because my colleague sent me a link and said, "Is this you?" It was. I won't pretend the attention was entirely comfortable. It wasn't. But what surprised me was how many people responded not with drama but with recognition. Women especially, but not only women. People who had been in some version of the same room, doing the same work, waiting for the same acknowledgement that never quite arrived in the form they needed. The comments were full of people saying, "I know exactly what this is." That meant something to me that I hadn't expected. The company reached a settlement on the acquisition litigation several months later. The terms were not public, but my cousin told me it was significant. Ryan stepped back from the director role. My father brought in an outside management team to stabilize things. I don't know all the details, and I've made a conscious choice not to dig into them. It's not my company anymore. My father sent me a letter, an actual handwritten letter, which surprised me about 4 months after our conversation on the street. It was 2 pages. He said some things I had needed to hear for a long time. He didn't make excuses, which surprised me more. He said he understood if I didn't want to respond, and that he wasn't writing because he wanted anything from me, but because he felt he owed me the honesty even if it was too late to change anything. I've read it several times. I haven't responded yet. I'm not sure if I will. I'm not holding anger about it anymore, which is different from being ready to rebuild something. Those are 2 different things, and I'm trying to honor that distinction. What I know is this: I am 39 years old. I have a career that I built on my own terms, with people who chose me specifically and explicitly, not because I happened to share their last name and fill a gap they couldn't otherwise close. I wake up on Monday mornings without dread. I make decisions without second-guessing whether someone who should love me will misread my confidence as arrogance. For a long time, I thought the goal was to be recognized by the people who were supposed to recognize you first. Your family, the people who watched you grow, the people who should know better than anyone what you're capable of. I don't think that anymore. The goal is to get so good, and to build something so solid that recognition becomes irrelevant. Not because it stops hurting to be overlooked, I'm not sure it ever stops hurting entirely. But because the thing you've built is real and measurable and yours, and nobody's willful blindness can undo it. My father chose my brother. He restructured his company around a decision he didn't have the courage to make directly. He spent 11 months watching that decision unravel. And then he stood on a sidewalk and I told him the truth, plainly and without performance, and I walked back to a job I love. I think about my mother sometimes, the woman I was always told I resembled in ways that made my father uncomfortable. I never got to know her as an adult. I don't know if she would recognize what I've built or if she'd have advice about what comes next. But I think she'd understand why I finally stopped waiting.